welcome. You join me in Philip's summer house. Let's call it a summer house. Garden shed. If you came to our service on Sunday in person, or perhaps you viewed online at the same time or later, or maybe you viewed our short version with just the sermon and the readings, you will have seen and heard Philip and myself talking about a particular piece of artwork in reference to the Sunday's readings. And you'll remember that this Sunday just gone, we were in the midst of Trinity and thinking about God as Father, Son and Spirit. And so the piece of art that we looked at in that service and in a house group which took place this week was the one you can see here, and it will flash up on your screen by the magic of technology, an icon by Rublev.
Yes.
Philip, can you tell us something about the icon itself, its history and what it's meant to represent?
Well, it's hot news at the moment because it's been removed from its official display case in the Chechikov Museum in Moscow, because it's very delicate. It's not been very well treated in its past, and I'm afraid Mr. Putin has absconded with it. We think it's in the Moscow Cathedral, which is a horrible, great big barn of a place, which is quite unsuitable with atmospherics, so it's in danger. And it really represents Russia. It's so sacred to the people, and has been for 5-6 centuries now. It's crucial for them that it should be treated with respect. I'm afraid it's entered politics.
So it, as a piece of art, it dates from the early 15th century?
Yes, about the time of Mother Julian here, when there was lots of strange things happening. I think the Bible was translated by Wycliffe at the same time, and
the churches were changing hugely.
Yes, things were moving. So then, this, because it's a new insight into the representation of the Trinity. It's an icon, as you can see, this reproduction, and the icons of the Trinity were not like this. It never used 3 individual angels from a story in Genesis. So Rublev, Andrei Rublev, was a monk at this time, and he's regarded as the most sacred, most insightful, most exquisite icon painter ever. We have very few works by him, but this certainly is.
And so you mentioned there the story in Genesis that it depicts, because it's 2 things, isn't it, really? It's a doctrinal statement about the Trinity,
especially for the Greek Orthodox.
But it's also a documentary picture in some senses, some kind of a story being told before us, which represents a story which many of us will know from Genesis.
Like most religious paintings, it has a story. This in a different kind of technique, because it's an icon. Icons are not realistic paintings. They're from a different tradition. Most Western art tends to be realistic or even idealistic, and you can recognise the objects as what you might meet in everyday life. You're never going to meet anything like this in everyday life, because it's a window into heaven. That's for the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, and the Eastern Church in particular. Icons are the 5th gospel. They're as sacred as that. They are insightful into the message about God and salvation.
Well, and indeed, when people talk about the creation of icons, they're written rather than painted, aren't they?
Yes.
It's interesting.
And prayed over as they're painted too.
So what have we got happening, in terms of the actual action going on here? Who are the characters that we see, and what are they doing?
Well, if you read Genesis 18, at least Genesis 18, you'll see that this is a story about hospitality in the desert, right down by the Dead Sea, where Abraham, who's the first person to respond to God positively, God makes a covenant with Abraham, says, I want you to set off. And he sets off, doesn't know where he's going, so he's wandering around. So he's a Bedouin. And quite a well-off Bedouin, because he's got lots of sheep and goats and so on, and he lives by encamping and moving about, a hunter-gatherer almost. And he is in the desert at the heat of the day, and he has 3 visitors. Now, in the Bedouin tradition and in the Arab tradition in the East, hospitality is the most important thing you can cherish. So an opportunity to look after people is sacred. And so Abraham in the story sees these three obviously looking rather respectable characters, and even if they weren't, they would be welcome. And he offers to make them a meal. And he says, well, first of all, he says, would you please stay with us, just sit down, and I'll bring a little water to wash your feet. That's the invitation. And then he shouts to his wife Sarah. I should explain that he and Sarah are reported to be 99 years old, and tells her to make a feast, get moving. And he runs about collecting the fatted calf, as it were, and so they sit there and chat, and Abraham behaves as a well brought up Bedouin and serves these three visitors. And there's a conversation, and Sarah is in the tent listening. Women weren't allowed to come to this kind of gathering. Their role was to, I'm afraid, to do all the housewifely things.
Do the dishes.
And the men had the deep conversations. And they ask where Sarah is. And he says, oh, she's in the tent. And of course she's there listening. And they say, well, this time next year, because God has promised you, you're going to be a father of a great nation. You know this already. And the role of this nation is to be a blessing to the world. She will have a child, because I know you've got an illegitimate child, but that doesn't count. We'll look after him. But you're going to have a child. And he's been told this before and didn't really take it in. In fact, he laughed. God pretended not to notice. He winked at it. But this time, Sarah laughs in the tent. And they say, why did Sarah laugh? And she says to herself, because we have this recorded, how am I going to manage to have a child and have the pleasure of having a child at my age, and so when she's called, she says she denies that she laughed. But the angels, or one of them, says, you laughed, and you're going to call the child laughter. And actually Hebrew means God laughs. That needs unpacking, but that's the story, and that's what's happening here. And how it's depicted is extremely fascinating, if you want to hear about that.
Well, yeah, I think one of the key things about this is, as you said, it's one of it's a rare instance of God appearing in any kind of human-like form.
It's the only instance in the Old Testament. God speaks, he's behind a cloud, or he's in lightning, thunder, rain. He makes these kind of manifestations, or he speaks interiorly to the people often. Moses gets a glimpse of his backside, we're told, but no actual face-to-face encounter. This is the only record of such an event.
So the thing it makes me think of is when you talk to children of primary school age and you ask them to draw God. I don't, because it's a bonkers thing to do, but I know it's something that people do from time to time. And very often he looks a bit like Father Christmas, usually with a beard, perhaps inspired by Michelangelo or whoever else. And you get this image of God. It's not usually like this. And so it's an interesting kind of pivot onto from Old Testament story into a Christologically informed kind of theology almost, because this icon was written long after Jesus, so with a Christian mindset, but written back onto something that happened in Old Testament times.
It's actually reading something into this story that probably isn't there. But that's useful for us who are Christians to have this understanding about the Trinity, although this would not occur to Abraham at all, or anybody who is Jewish. They see this as a revelation of God, an epiphany of God to another human being. to a human being, in the guise of a human being. So it's almost like a precursor to what we call the incarnation.
Yeah. So as this was presented on Sunday, which was Trinity Sunday, a day when we think about that knotty and difficult doctrine that the Church has of God as three in one, yet unified. What does this icon and the way it's painted offer to us in our understanding of Trinity, do you think?
Well, you can't go away with the image of Father Christmas, because it's nothing like that. In fact, they're all the characters are exactly the same. They're all equal. If you notice, they look the same. They are in harmony, and it's all to do with balance and harmony. Because I think you may have seen me do this. There's a circle here. There's a perfect square in the circle. There's some triangles, equilateral triangles. So it's perfectly balanced and symmetrical. Nobody's in charge, and there's motion moving either way, and it's peaceful. There's also abstract shapes. Those are more abstract shapes. This in particular, in the middle here, this communion cup or whatever it is, or something with a tiny calf in maybe, is a centerpiece, as you can see. And also the perspective is all haywire. It's not because they didn't know about perspective, they did, but they turned it on its head. Normally this perspective would be a vanishing point in the distance, and everything would be in tramlines towards it. The perspective here is you, me, whoever's looking, is actually at this table. It sucks us into the painting in a way that nothing else can, because we are the vanishing point, the people looking. So we are included in this dialogue, in this mystery, in this sharing of harmonious discussion and promise. So it makes us part of the picture.
And I think there's something really powerful there. You know, the story that you spoke of, on which the icon's based from Genesis, is one which expresses that deeply rooted cultural value of hospitality and welcome. And how interesting that is, that when we think of the Trinity, we don't think of a locked down triangle, you know, or a Celtic Trinity knot which is bounded and closed. We're actually looking at something which is all about hospitality, and I think, as you mentioned on Sunday, it's hospitality not just for these three, but there's a gap here.
Yes, and we fill the gap, and we're included, and of course it also empties itself like it's this kind of funnel into us. So the grace of this, the joy, the happiness, the peace, the whatever, the conviviality, empties into us. So what we call it grace. So we receive this because the whole, not only does that shape do the same, that shape, this abstract shape, the negative shape, and these figures all pivot on you. You have to be there to make that complete.
Yeah, it's like a flow of energy or warmth or hospitality towards this.
This is amazing theology. We are part of the Trinity. We are included.
And that, I suppose that takes us to something about icons as a medium, really. You mentioned it already, but icons are meant to be a window. They're not meant to be venerated in themselves, which is the kind of Reformation, the crux of the Reformation debate to some extent. You know, are we worshipping the relics or are we using them to point to something else? This icon and all icons are meant to draw us into a dialogue, a relationship, into that hospitality.
Yes. They're kind of signals or signposts. They're glimpses of glory, another way of defining it. They're very careful not to be representational. Moses came a bit later, but Moses receives the law of God, and the second commandment is, thou shalt not make any graven image, any likeness. So that's not trying to be a likeness, it's trying to be a kind of, a spy hole, a viewing point into the way things really are, or should be, in life.
I can't help thinking, because this painting, this icon, is somewhat contemporary with the artwork in our church in Cawston.
Oh yes.
I talk to visitors often about the church, how it would have been a complete riot of colour, and in a world where these colours were quite rare, really. So in daily life, especially the blues,
Yes.
the reds were pretty common and available from the earth, but the blues and the greens were quite rich colours. And so going to church...
And expensive.
Yeah.
Lapis lazuli.
Exactly. So going to a church and seeing a rood screen in this country painted with richly decorated robes, all the characters in richly decorated robes, or the roof angels in Cawston, with their, we know that there was blue azurite up there. We know that there was gold up there. It must have been such an experience, a high cultural visual experience for people who've never seen anything like it.
Yeah. It's coming from your peasant shack into that. It's just mind-blowing. And Eastern Orthodoxy tries to maintain that tradition. If you go in the Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Church, I mean, it's all full of light and joy and richness and glory, and you're there in the heavenly space, as it were.
And again, was intended as a reflection of God's glory, or a prism for us to view God's glory, rather than something to be worshipped in and of itself, which is the huge shame about what happened to our churches post-Reformation. That they were lots of the artworks were erased and destroyed. 90%. Yeah, which makes me feel so privileged to minister in the place that I do, Cawston.
Extraordinary.
And I'll put up some images on the screen for you, for those of you who don't know Cawston, to show you the roof angels that we still have, some of the panels from the rood screen, the wall painting of St Agnes. There's such a treasure trove.
Yes.
But even then, it's a fraction of what there was.
It's meant to point you beyond itself, it's not the full stop. You don't worship that or think how lovely, how wonderful. Oh, that gives me an insight into whoever's being disclosed in the painting or the saints or whatever. It helps. Yeah. Mother Julian, who's contemporary with this, had a lovely phrase about the saints. They are kind neighbours of our knowing. Like our neighbours. Go and have a chat with them. And she would be used to wood screens were being painted during her lifetime.
Yeah.
So, neighbourly conversation, we must get back to it, by the way, is so important for conviviality and a sense of well-being and being part of the community and the sacred community, praying. So you're in contact with those who've gone before.
Yes, that's the notion of the kingdom as being across all time and all space. And so therefore that, again, highlights the importance of this image, which reaches back into the Old Testament story and brings it to life, but also does it from this standpoint of an understanding of a Trinitarian doctrine.
Yes.
By the 1400s, there was a clearly developed Trinitarian doctrine in the church. And this is an attempt by Rublev to say, okay, let's think about it differently. Let's not just draw geometric patterns to represent God or whatever else it might be. Let's do something which is personal.
Yes. We in the West would represent the Trinity in quite a different way. You might try and find a Masaccio image of... and there's one in Norfolk somewhere, which was rediscovered recently, a few years ago, in a tiny church.
Okay.
A wall painting of the same iconography. The design is, God the Father with the beard, holding his crucified Son, and you have to search for it, but all fluttering around somewhere is a white dove. So you've got Father, Son and Holy Spirit. But it doesn't compare to this. It's a bit grotesque.
Yes, and also I think simplified. The thing I like about this image is that it leaves open to us a sophisticated understanding of the Trinity, which doesn't reduce it to the stuff that's separated the church over years about, who comes first and what's the subordination and all of that kind of stuff, which divides East from West still. This icon doesn't have that. It actually has lots of openness and space for us to bring our own experience of Trinity, our biblical experience of Trinity, and say, okay, well, any image that we paint, any simile or metaphor we try to use, whether it's one of these fidget spinners with 3 spokes, or ice, steam and water, as I mentioned on Sunday, they're all limited. This is limited, but this is limited in a nicely open way, which says, here's an image of 3 angels, God appearing in the desert, but it's not the limit.
And also, it's very politically apposite at the moment because Russia is becoming an enclosed, frightened, angry community led by a tyrant who feeds them falsehoods. And they need to break out of that because this is about openness, this is about new life. It depicts a story which is a promise of a new impossible birth.
Yeah.
So the story behind this imagery is of an amazing thing that will happen through something which is just impossible. Why did they laugh? Because they didn't think they were capable of such a thing. But they were and are, and so are we. And so is Holy Russia. Needs to open up, share this message with all of us, and we need to get away from fear and suspicion and hatred and violence and lockdown and all that. We had enough of that. It's time to move forward. This could be an inspiration for a new age, I think.
Yes, and it represents the openness and the possibilities, doesn't it, of relationship with God.
Yes.
It's not closed, it's not finished, God's work isn't done. There's more going on here, and crucially, you are invited in as the fourth person at this table.
Do read that story in Genesis 18 and 19 because you'll see why they're here. And they're here because of violence, wickedness, hatred, a cry from the people of Sodom and Gomorrah about being abused and ill-treated, the anguish of people who, the unheard, is being heard by God. The cry came to God and he's come down to see what's happening. And Abraham is involved in all of it. It's a wonderful story, and he starts to bargain with God, and you get hooked on the Old Testament if you read that story.
So, I think that takes you a bit further than we went on Sunday. Hopefully it gives you some ideas of things to read or to look at or to think about in the meantime. Do tune in on Sunday for the next of our series where there'll be a different work of art and relating this time to a gospel passage, and indeed for the following 2 weeks after that. And each week we'll try and do one of these chats just to see if we can pick at the surface a little bit more and give you some ideas as to what might be going on. So thank you, Philip, for joining me for a chat.
Thank you for those who have tuned in.
Yeah, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.